Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Rupa. I'm Sustainability Consultant at Turner and Townsend. Today, we are joined by Dan Leeming, consultant also working at Turner and Townsend. This is a retrofit information, support, and expertise event which is fully funded by Department of Energy Security and Net Zero and delivered by Turner and Townsend. And once again, thank you for joining today. And I will now hand over to Dan.
Thank you very much. So welcome everyone to today's session on preparing contracts and agreements for the Warm Homes Local Grant. It's just a relatively simple agenda, I suppose, to go through. But in essence, we're just going to have a quick look at some of the agreement and the parties involved within the Warm Homes Local Grant Scheme, and then have a quick look through the agreements between DESNZ and the lead grant recipient, which lead in a consortium, or I suppose if you're an individual grant recipient on your own, you, and then a look at the agreements between lead grant recipients and consortium members, so probably less relevant if you're an individual into the fund, and then lastly between grant recipient and delivery partners. That's kind of more the contract management-y sort of side of things, I suppose. There is a quick disclaimer though, so that's kind of just to say this is quite a broad agreement overview of the agreements that you might typically encounter for the Warm Homes Funds. I am not a lawyer, so where possible, please do talk to your organisation's legal team or an external legal advisor if required. If you've got any uncertainties or specific questions about specific agreements, particularly some of the more complicated ones, obviously the agreements I'm most familiar with on this scheme will be the MOU, for example, between DESNZ and the grant recipient. If you want to set up a special purpose vehicle or a JVA, definitely talk to a lawyer. Not me, because that's not my not my area of expertise. Yeah. So some of the acronyms that you'll see today, hopefully you're all familiar with DESNZ. The DSA you'll hear is referred to a lot, the data sharing agreement. The grant recipient, GR, JVA, sort of joint venture agreement, just a type of legal agreement basically. An MOU, memorandum of understanding, and an SLA, service level agreement, which is sort of something we'll talk about a little bit when we get to that kind of contract management-y section. So in terms of an agreement, what is an agreement? It's just a mutual understanding or arrangement between two or more parties outlining the rights, responsibilities, and obligations. So quite simple and straightforward, but those three key words are really key: rights, responsibilities, and obligations. So things like the MOU, for example, we're going to typically talk about what is involved in terms of parties, so your names of DESNZ and your organisation. The terms and conditions, that's the details of the commitments. Duration, how long is that agreement going to last? You'll typically have to sign it, both parties or every party involved will have to sign. And there will be some clauses with additional provisions usually as well. So confidentiality, dispute resolution, if applicable, things like that. Always good to read the dispute resolution bit before signing anything, I think, with things like these MOUs. No doubt that's what your legal teams will be probably very interested in terms of understanding the level of risk as an organisation that you might be taking on by signing something. So the parties involved with the Warm Homes schemes, we've got Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, so DESNZ, the people with all the money that they're dispensing. The grant recipient, so that's you. The lead grant recipient, so that's kind of really an important distinction basically for consortium projects where the money is going to the lead and then the lead will distribute that money amongst the consortium, and then delivery partners as well. So quite often many projects will have a turnkey provider or a principal contractor, somebody that's going to be delivering that work, right? So yeah, those are kind of the main parties from a legal agreements perspective that we sort of are concerned with. Obviously, there's also people whose homes we're going into, and they normally have to sign to agree to have some works and stuff, but we're not going to be looking at that kind of thing so much in this session, really. So let's have a look at the agreements between DESNZ and the lead grant recipients, or the grant recipient if you're just an individual bidder. So the DSA, this is kind of one of the first big ones. This sets out the data sharing arrangements between DESNZ and the lead grant recipient. And there's some key principles on this that it sort of is attempting to establish. So this is kind of like your GDPR type stuff, basically. So lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. So it's ensuring that you agree that all data processing activities are conducted legally, fairly, and transparently. The data is going to have its purpose it's quite limited, so it's going to be used solely for the purposes that are defined in this agreement. Storage limitation as well, so the data will only be retained for as long as is necessary to fulfill its intended purposes. And then, yeah, accountability as well. So it's going to just hold both DESNZ and you as the grant recipient responsible for compliance with data protection principles. And obviously, the whole point of this is to really sort of ensure that the risks in the handling of that data, because we're going to be handling personal information, obviously names and addresses, or that kind of thing, tenant contact information, that we don't want that to be, the longer we're handling that, obviously the more risk there is that something is leaked accidentally, or there's a risk that data is compromised and ends up in the hands of somebody that it shouldn't. So this is really trying to minimize the amount of time we're handling that data so that we can get the results we need, but making sure that we're not accidentally leaking names and addresses or something horrendous like that, which would cause all sorts of headaches for people. So I think there are 7 principles included in the draft DSA. The other principles sort of accountability, data minimization, integrity and confidentiality, and accuracy as well. So again, this should be available on the web page for the scheme. Consortium leads are responsible for signing the data agreement amongst consortium members where necessary as well. So it's sort of, this is between this DSA between DESNZ and the lead grant recipient, but probably you need to share information between consortium members within a group. You probably want something to kind of mirror this, I guess, so that the data is handled appropriately within your consortium, and then it can be fed up through to DESNZ as it's needed. So there's some key steps for getting DSA signed. First one is getting senior level buy-in, obviously. Hopefully that shouldn't be too challenging. If you've already signed up for the scheme, this isn't normally the deal breaker for people normally, at least at senior level. Maybe with your legal teams, maybe they've got some specific queries, but there will be some sort of internal sign-off process as well that you'll have to go through. So making sure you've identified that's all sort of in hand to review the draft agreement. And obviously that's typically where the legal team will come in, or the GDPR data protection officer, and give it the nod, hopefully. And if there are any issues with it, then they will typically raise them at that stage. You want to kind of establish clear timelines and deadlines as well. So you don't have years to get this thing signed. It needs to be signed off before the money's released as well. Reviewing the DSA with the person responsible for data governance. So that might be your data protection officer, something like that as well. So a few fairly straightforward things to sort out there, but you just really want to try and make sure that you're familiar with, okay, who has to sign this off and get this through, and who needs to review it, and when do they need to review it by. At a high level, it's quite straightforward in terms of what you need to do for getting that signed off. So this is the agreements between the lead grant recipients and consortium members. So move on to this now. So this is the MOU. So this is as well, there will be one of these between the lead grant recipient and DESNZ, of course, but often there is also an MOU within a consortium as well. So an MOU is normally the sort of starting point of negotiations between 2 or more parties, and it sort of suffices in the case of Warm Homes Local Grant for enabling funding to go to local authorities from DESNZ. So it is the primary legal agreement, I suppose, that the people will be concerned with. I'm not a lawyer, but I think this is something to do basically because compared to something like the Warm Homes Social Housing Fund, for example, where there is a grant funding agreement, which is a slightly different type of legal agreement, you can get away with, I think, using an MOU to distribute the funding amongst local authorities, because local authorities already have various pre-existing agreements with central government, because obviously most of their funding comes from central government. So I believe that's roughly the sort of reason why it's an MOU for a local grant as opposed to a GFA like it is on the Social Housing Fund, which is obviously open to housing associations and things, as well as local authorities, and those HAs won't have those other agreements in place. But maybe ask your legal teams about if I'm on the right track with that one. So basically the MOU is just trying to sort of agree the commitment, the resources, and other considerations that each of the parties will bring. So again, it's who's involved. It will say between DESNZ and you, the lead grant recipient, the details and the scope of the project and the responsibilities of everyone involved, and the general terms of collaboration. So in terms of the MOU between the lead grant recipient and DESNZ, that's going to talk about how much money is to be distributed, when that might be distributed, what to do if there's a dispute, or giving the I think they call it the authority typically in some of these MOUs I've seen, referring to DESNZ, the power to sort of claw back funding and things like that if things go wrong. So that's always a very important one to read the fine print for as well. But then your MOU within a consortium is probably going to be very similar and sort of mirror that MOU as well, so that you're basically able to move money around within the consortium as needed, and establish things like reporting requirements or what to do in some sort of, if there's some sort of dispute, so that if things go wrong between the lead and DESNZ, or the consortium as a whole and DESNZ, again, you've got that ability to sort of move things all up and down the chain through that lead grant recipient. So separate MOU between the lead grant recipient and DESNZ, and then a separate sort of consortium one to allow things to happen between consortium members. So in general, as a legal principle, an MOU sort of has moral force but does not create legal obligations. If you want to know a bit more about that, again, I would highly recommend speaking to your legal team as to kind of what risks and stuff you're taking on by signing an MOU. And again, the draft MOU, if you haven't, hopefully by now you've received the MOU for your project, and you're in the process of trying to get that signed and reviewed by your own legal teams. But if you are interested in reading that draft MOU, without obviously kind of like blank 000 or XXX for the amount of funding or whatever that's being distributed, fill in the blanks, you can find that at the .gov page for the Warm Homes Local Grant Scheme as well. So other types of agreements, there is collaborative working, joint working, or partnership agreements as well. So this is sort of I suppose, referring to a collection of legal vehicles, I guess, that are a little bit more binding maybe than an MOU. And it's something that within a consortium you might be interested in doing, particularly if you're working in a group that's kind of looking beyond local grant at a longer term project, or a project between yourself and external partners, or something that has, I guess, objectives that might go beyond this particular window of funding. So that might be something like like a wider area-based fuel poverty type scheme, for example, a long-term project for the next 10 years, something like that. I don't know. But you would typically, again, have the objectives and the scope within that kind of agreement, the roles and responsibilities, and then some establishment of governance and decision making within that partnership. So who has control and the authority to make certain decisions, which again, with an MOU, it might be a little bit more sort of decentralized. Yes, you all have to kind of pull in the same direction. For example, with the MOU between consortium to sort of do the Warm Homes Local Grant, you might have to sort of all pull in the same direction and kind of report things in the same way, because that's how things work. But ultimately, the lead grant recipient cannot really, doesn't have generally kind of the legal authority to start enforcing things on other legally distinct organisations within that consortium, at least outside the terms of whatever the funding agreement is from DESNZ, right? Whereas with something like this, they might gain a bit more sort of power and ability to sort of shape the direction and ways in which people work. Other details typically included in that kind of joint working or partnership agreement might be like things like how you're managing risk and resource sharing. So that could be financial, technical, human, and performance metrics as well. So how are you going to measure the success of the ways in which you're working? Are you going to hold yourself to any particular objectives, and what are the consequences of that? And then there's also probably going to be sort of terms for dissolving that partnership agreement as well, in there as well, which there is also something like that in the MOU as well, if you do need to exit the scheme early. So a more formal type of legal agreement to kind of bind people together in Consortiums might be something like a JVA, so a joint venture agreement. So I think it gives the example here, like maybe creating a special purpose vehicle to coordinate retrofit activities in your area, or entering into a joint venture with an energy services company or another provider. So they're a bit more sort of specialist projects, I guess. So most people won't be looking at doing something like this. It'd be more like you had an idea for something, and then you'd want to create one of these to help achieve that objective, and also maybe you can take advantage of something like the local grant to kind of assist you in that. But it's sort of above and beyond, I suppose, what would be required generally for just doing a local grant project as a group. So yeah, in a joint venture, the partners sort of share ownership of the project. So that's the profits and losses, risks and governance. It obviously takes more time to set up. So again, that's why I come back to this, this kind of longer term project, or a project which kind of might encompass LG, but it sort of looks beyond this particular funding window or cycle. Because most people will just want to crack on delivering their LG project, and if you're only interested in LG, then why would you go to all this trouble to create something that's when an MOU would suffice effectively? But if you do have sort of a more complicated or nuanced project, maybe this is something to consider. And if you are kind of in that territory, then again, I would highly suggest speaking to your legal team about that. The consortium data sharing agreements. So this is kind of as what I was hinting at earlier, in terms of when we talk about the DSA, you need to kind of have a strategy for sharing data within that group that will allow the LEES grant recipient to then report effectively up the chain to DESNZ. So there has to be a strategy for collecting, checking, and summarising financial and delivery data from all members. So how much have you spent? How many homes have you delivered? At what stage of those homes, etc. So that can all be then reported to DESNZ in a timely and effective manner. And I think if you're interested, again, in trying to understand what that reporting cycle might look like, or reporting obligations throughout the scheme, the MOU, the draft MOU, and hopefully your actual MOU that you're looking at now will have information on that kind of thing within it. So member-specific data should be held by the consortium lead and made available to DESNZ upon request. So it's not something they have to provide, but it has to be available if requested. And consortiums may also consider establishing a separate data sharing agreement, independent of broader consortium agreements, to sort of simplify the legal review process as well. So it can sort of help ease some of the admin in terms of sharing things within the group as well. So some top tips for getting these kinds of agreements together. You want to start early. So if you're in a consortium, agreements can often take longer to put together than you think. There'll be multiple checks and risk reviews at different levels within each organisation, and that's several sets of internal governance procedures, and maybe someone can get it done within a few weeks, and someone else might have to wait for a bi-monthly panel or something for that decision to be ratified. So there can be many things within that can end up taking a long time to get everyone sort of together and getting that signed. You want to have a clear purpose. So the scheme guidance actually talks about consortia must not be formed in name only. So there should be a clear value of working together. So maybe, I don't know, you're a bunch of smaller authorities and there is a much larger authority within your area next door, and maybe you can then help share resources, knowledge, leads, that kind of thing, and it's just more economically efficient to work as a group. That would be obviously a sort of a clear purpose and a reason to work together, particularly when it comes to things like FTE requirements, resourcing, that kind of thing. And then that kind of clear vision of why you should be working together, that's really what DESNZ are looking for. Clear decision making and communication between members as well. So by the time things are signed, all partners must be in a position to receive funds from the lead applicant, contract work, and share data between consortium partners. That's what the scheme guidance says by the time the MOU is signed. So you really want to have that clear decision-making process and communication to enable that to happen. You don't want any annoying little admin hold-ups. When things are signed, you should be ready to go and engage in the next steps. You don't want people getting left behind. Understanding the roles and the scheme requirements as well. So consortium leads and members should be clear on their roles, and make sure that any SLAs that are required under scheme funding are included in the consortium agreement. So reporting deadlines, for example, reconciliation deadlines, financial sort of audits, these kinds of things are normally buried within the MOU. So review it, make a little note of, okay, we need to submit every 6 months, every year or halfway through the scheme, a reasonable assurance report as part of our forward requirements, and we need to get an external auditor together to do that. Okay, let's put that in the calendar. Okay, on the I don't know, the 10th working day of every month, we need to submit scheme data for the month, and that's going to probably include financial data and number of homes treated, etc. Let's put that in the calendar. So having a clear understanding of those what the scheme requires then lets you sort of be very clear about those obligations and cascade them down into your consortium. Also wanting to standardize agreements across the consortium. So to save time, you really want to obviously standardize agreements between consortium members rather than having to make bespoke agreements between one lead grant recipient and every single consortium member, because that will take a long time and it's also more confusing to manage generally. And then regular reviews as well. So making sure that you're meeting on at least a semi-regular basis, and just see you've got some sort of point to flag when something isn't working, what is working, and where you can kind of look to refine your agreements to make them work better for you, really. So that's the top tips. So this is the sort of the contract management sort of section. So agreements between grant recipient and delivery partners. So an SLA, a contract, we're not kind of going into, should you use a JCT or an NEC or whatever type of contract. We're just going to focus particularly, I think, on SLAs, service level agreements, because those are really kind of rules, or that's the thing you can use to sort of enforce, I guess, things, because they have legal force with your contractors. So SLAs sort of set out the expectations between a customer and a supplier of some sort. It's a contractual set of obligations or expectations with legal force, where you might have a collaborative working agreement or an MOU with strategic partners. So there might be other LAs and community organizations, whoever it is. You'll have an SLA or a contract with a managing agent or a delivery partner on your retrofit project. So this is where you'll often have clear deliverables, performance metrics. So what are you going to sort of use to measure the contractor's performance? So are there energy efficiency targets, completion times, adherence to budgets? They're kind of your protection that you're going to get a minimum level of service. You're going to get these particular deliverables in terms of timelines and quality standards, etc. Everyone is kind of agreed this is what the output should be, right? Risk management as well. So it'll have potential risks and outline mitigation strategies, so contingency plans for delays, cost overruns, unforeseen circumstances. If this thing happens, then we will do this. Payment terms, what are the milestones and conditions for payment releases? This is a really important one, particularly when you read the MOU and you see things like the conditions for what is required to claim grant funding. Obviously, you've got to have like your trust marks and everything sorted. So one of the things I've been hearing from people delivering on SHDF 2.12 and HUG 2 is not paying contractors until the trust mark is received, and that really helps get the trust marks through quicker, because obviously they want their money, and that can help prevent sort of building up these massive backlogs with trust mark, which makes your reporting worse and everything. So little things like that. You don't want to make things impossible for a contractor and really rile them up and disgruntle them and create a bad working relationship. But you do just perhaps want to think about, if they want the money, what is it that I really need them to have? Because once I've paid them, obviously I have a lot less leverage over them to kind of pester them for things that's a lot more difficult. And again, the other thing to consider with this is sort of maintaining cash flow and ensuring that the payments are tied to that project progress. Warranty and maintenance as well. So warranty and maintenance responsibilities, the contractor making sure they're accountable for the long-term performance of the retrofit work. Dispute resolution, another very important one, unfortunately. So a clear process for resolving disputes, including mediation and arbitration procedures. That can really help avoid lengthy and costly legal battles, which is the one thing that you really don't want to end up in, because that will not only ruin your project, cause things to freeze up, maybe because you can't re-procure or something and get someone to finish the work, but obviously comes with a big price tag and a massive headache and a lot of stress for your legal teams. So we really want to be trying to nip things like that in the bud by having a clear dispute resolution process and a way to exit contracts if things start going awry. And then, yeah, compliance and reporting. So compliance with relevant regulations and standards. So obviously where it talks about in the guidance and the MOU about MCS, Trustmark, PAS 2035, all of that stuff needs to be in your contract reflecting that quite simply. So yeah, there should be clauses as well for regular reporting and documentation to track compliance and project progress as well. So yeah, lots of sort of little things to think about within that kind of SLA or contract environment. But I'm sure many of you will have worked on projects before where you've come up against an issue with a contractor, and it would have been it could have been mitigated to an extent, perhaps, by having had something to kind of deal with that situation in that contract at the start. So yeah, hopefully you don't need to use a lot of those kind of levers to get a contractor to do what you want, because hopefully they'll do really well. But yeah, when it does tend to go wrong, it's really helpful to have that safety net to get you out of trouble. So again, with these kind of contracts, start early for obvious reasons. It normally takes longer than you think. Determine the milestones with care. So the classic one, yeah, final payments to contractors once the property has been lodged, rather than when shovels are down on site, so that you can kind of just tick things off. That's probably the classic example that I've seen the last few years. Maintaining responsibility for the project as well. So ultimately it is you, not the contractor, that is responsible for the project. So one of the sort of in my opinion, one of the biggest mistakes we see with delivery partners, for example, is organizations just kind of handing everything over to a delivery partner, and they don't really maintain a very good oversight in terms of what is actually happening on their projects, and they just kind of take the narrative from the delivery partner once a month or something and don't really do much of their own scrutiny. That's normally how you're putting yourself in a position to sort of be led down the garden path a little bit. Or if there is a particular issue with, I don't know, a particular subcontractor, it's kind of invisible to you. It's just a bad spot to be in from that kind of accountability perspective, when it is ultimately Desners have an agreement with you. So you need to make sure that when you're putting your agreements together with these contractors, that you are, again, cascading that obligation and ensuring that what is happening down there is what Desners want up there. Again, yeah, really important to maintain that responsibility for the project, and consider clauses on subcontractors as well. So I've just been saying about if you've got an issue with the subcontractor, maybe the delivery partner, you don't know about it and stuff. I've seen some places where they have delivery partners or managing agents, but they maintain quite a high degree of control over who can actually be allowed onto the scheme. So quite often they have things like subcontractor agreements. So to even get onto the project and be available to work for that delivery partner or managing agent, the subcontractor would have to sign a sort of an agreement effectively that would be able to hold them to account in terms of performance standards, etc. Because then if you get a problem with a subcontractor, you can simply point to the agreement, say you're not upholding your end of the deal, off you go back to eco or whatever it is. You're not coming on my scheme. You're not up to scratch. And I've seen those agreements be used to great effect to kind of nip issues in the bud, with particularly where people needed to bring in more capacity into their supply chain, and they kind of historically knew that certain subcontractors might be a little bit, they might not have had the best experience with them before, so they have that in there as a safety net. And then, yeah, as I say, I have seen it where they have had to use that safety net because it's there. The project hasn't been compromised. So always a really important one. Don't hand everything over to a delivery partner. Make sure that you've still got some involvement and oversight at all of this, because and this all kind of leads pretty much into that last point, embedding quality assurance. So you really want to ensure there are clear provisions within the contracts in case of non-compliance. So again, things like the clauses on the subcontractor, when the payment is released and according to what conditions, you can, through all of those little things, you can insist upon the standard that is required. Make sure that things as they should be. So just going to go on to a quick little summary now. So a recap of the Warm Homes Agreement, so for local grant. So between the lead grant recipient and DESNZ, there is the MOU, so that's the big main one, the data sharing agreement, and that's the other required one. And then if you are within a consortium, you might want to have an MOU between the consortium members and possibly a DSA as well to kind of help facilitate your reporting and everything and make sure that the lead grant recipient can fulfill their obligations to DESNZ as required by the MOU and DSA with DESNZ. If you are part of a group that is working on a sort of a more specialist project or project that's maybe a bit wider than LG, it's possibly worth looking at other legal vehicles, JVAs and things like that to facilitate sort of a more legally binding long-term collaborative partnership. But I expect for most people, most of you, that's probably not going to be necessary. And then lastly, that grant recipient and delivery partner agreement, so the contract between them with the SLAs that sort of are legally enforceable and hopefully allow you to achieve the objectives of your project. And then we also, of course, have plenty more resources on the RISE website as well, including pre-recorded masterclasses, articles, podcasts, a whole bunch more stuff on there as well. So please do have a little look on there.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Thanks for delivering the session.